And welcome to you, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you for coming here this afternoon. I really wanted to speak about volume 4 of this series, which is about the lives of engineers. But before I do that, I think it's best to give you an idea of what this whole series is all about and what it really means. Now, this whole series, Science and Civilization in Sri Lanka, has been modeled on a series called Science and Civilization in China, which was published by Professor Needham of Cambridge, who spent more or less his entire working life studying China and especially medieval China and the great things that they discovered and so on. And then he decided to write a volume about science and civilization in China. It was going to be just one volume, but then when he started writing it, first it became 7 volumes, and then those 7 volumes had different parts, and now he started writing the first volume came out in 1954, nearly 50 years ago. And since then, various other parts have come out, and so far 24 volumes have come out on science and civilization in China. 3 more volumes are in the course of preparation. Professor Needham died in 1995, but by that time he had already written a large part of the final volume, which is called Summary and Conclusions. But 3 more volumes are still to come. The scope of the Chinese volumes have been described as: the emphasis is on traditional forms of knowledge and practice, but without excluding modern studies which connect the topics with their historical and cultural content. The project has been described as perhaps the greatest single act of historical synthesis and intercultural communication ever attempted. So let's have a look at the titles of these 27 volumes and see how we have tried to model the Sri Lanka series on this Needham's famous Chinese series, which was in fact written. He was a professor at Cambridge, and his field was something quite different because he was a professor of biochemistry. And while he was writing all these books, he was still doing his day job of lecturing in biochemistry and writing books on biochemistry as well. So he is a genuine, a polymath, because out of the 24 volumes that have come out, 15 of the volumes were largely written by Professor Needham. Can you see it from the back? Otherwise, please come closer if you have difficulty in seeing it. So these are the first few volumes that came out, and those are the years in which those volumes came out. They didn't come out in consecutive order, so you can see introduction, history of scientific thought, mathematics, physics, mechanical engineering, civil engineering, paper and printing. And these were not small volumes. I mean, volume 403 on civil engineering is nearly 1,000 pages. These are the volumes, there are 4 volumes on what you call spagyrical discovery and invention. Spagyrical means alchemy, and alchemy, what we think of alchemy is the attempt made by medieval scientists to try and convert base metals into silver and gold. But actually the Chinese definition of alchemy was much broader than that. It in fact covers the whole field of chemistry, and not only chemistry, they try to discover a medicine that would to give you eternal life, and another medicine that would cure all illnesses, and that's why they've devoted 4 volumes to that. And then, of course, military technology. Of course, China invented gunpowder. Gunpowder continued, work in progress, textile, work in progress, ferrous metallurgy, ceramic, mining, botany, agriculture, agro-industries and forestry, food science, medicine, language and logic, general conclusions. So the last copies have come out 2004, but there are still 3 volumes to come out. So the Science and Civilization in Sri Lanka is sort of modeled on this, but of course not the same. At the moment, the plan is to have 11 volumes, but I have a feeling that one day when the whole series is finished, there will be far more volumes. So let's have a look at some of these things that some excerpts from Needham's books. Now, Needham actually has a connection with Sri Lanka. In 1958, the government wanted to appoint a commission, a higher education commission, to report on the future path for higher education and university education in Ceylon, at that time, Ceylon. And they decided to set up a commission, and they wanted a famous international academic to head the commission. And they decided to invite Professor Needham to come down to Sri Lanka for 6 months and be the head of the commission. And the second member of the commission was an Indian professor by the name of Chatterjee. And the third member was L.J.D.S. Senivaratna, who was a civil servant and later became secretary to the Treasury. So these people sat for 6 months and got representations from the public, written and oral, and then prepared their final report, and which was submitted to the government. And that led to the expansion of all the universities in Sri Lanka. But during the 6 months that Needham was here in Sri Lanka, he started traveling around and he became very interested in the ancient irrigation works of Sri Lanka. And he was very impressed also by these works. And he went around in the company of R.L. Prohier, who was then Deputy Surveyor General, and who had published 3 books on the ancient irrigation works of Sri Lanka. And he also went around with Paranavitana, who was then the archaeological commissioner and the first Sri Lankan to hold that post. So the strange thing is that when you look at Needham's book on China, it's supposed to be on China, but there are nearly 10 pages in volume 403, the civil engineering volume. There are nearly 10 pages about the ancient irrigation works of Sri Lanka. And here are some excerpts from his book. Now you can see he's talking about entry and exit gates in a contour canal, and he says comparable only with the irrigation contour canals of Ceylon. In other words, he has set the Ceylon canals or Sri Lankan canals as a sort of gold standard, and he's comparing canals in other countries with the canals here. And certainly nothing comparable in Europe. And then Needham has put in a sketch which he called the 4-stage hypothesis for the development of irrigation in Sri Lanka. This sketch was prepared by Needham after collecting information from Brohier. And because the writing is fairly small, I'll just run through it quickly. Stage 1 is rainwater tanks. Stage 2 is when they started building anicuts or small dams on streams. Stage 3 was where they built larger tanks, and in the process of building larger tanks, they sort of drowned some of the smaller tanks. And stage 4 was where they built a weir or anicut on a river and did a trans-basin diversion. So the water which was flowing down this valley is now diverted and comes through the ridge into the next valley. So there is a gentleman here in the audience, and he wrote to Professor Needham and said this explanation is not quite adequate, and he put forward a 7-stage hypothesis and wrote to Needham. And Needham immediately wrote to him and said, obviously my coverage of this subject is not complete. And he invited that gentleman to come to Cambridge and spend several weeks with him. and to improve on his coverage of this topic. And of course, that gentleman is none other than the person who just spoke to you, Mr. Mendes. And when Mr. Mendes was there at Needham, in the Needham Research Institute in Cambridge, and he got a chance to study the Needham volumes of China, that inspired him one day to write a similar series about Sri Lanka. And that is how this whole project was born. Again, another excerpt from Needham's China book, where he talks about Giant's Tank near Manna. Now, Giant's Tank is a 6-mile embankment because it's on very sort of flat land. It's not in a valley or something, so it needs a very long bund. So it has the embankment forms 3 sides of a square, and the feeder canal comes 17 miles from Mallotoya. And at the time of completion, it was the 3rd largest reservoir in the whole world. Then he talks about the oblique weir, which had the adequate traversing the stream at angles never more than 45 degrees to prevent damage to the weirs. And goes on to say, this was not adopted in Europe until much later. So the Sri Lankan 45-degree diversions were probably the first in the world. Then he talks about the most striking invention was the intake towers or well towers or Biso Kotua, which were fitted in the reservoirs from the 7th century AD onwards. And the way that is made is that it firstly it takes water without silt and scum, and also it prevents damage to the canal downstream, and you could alter the flow by putting in either planks made of stone or wood, and and as he ends up, he says, such were the highest developments of South Asian hydraulic engineering in ancient and medieval times. There's nothing else anywhere in the world to compare with this, is there, Mr. Mendes? Hello?
Those civilizations all closed up at some time. The book collapsed by describe those things, but our
Yeah.
continues.
Exactly, yes, yeah. So we now come on to the Sri Lankan version of Science and Civilization, and this is the beginning of the contents of Volume 1, Part 1. The first volume, which may be regarded as a sort of philosophical prospectus for the work as a whole, will contain both the exposition of the plan of scientific work and the outline of a strategy that begins with the Anuradhapura civilization and brings the work into the global context of current affairs. The first volume consists of 2 parts. One relates to the plan of the first series of works and is the work of several authors. Each author is an authority on the topic described, and the other part will be published shortly afterwards. So these are the 3 main articles in Volume 1, all by experts in their field. And that completes the contents of Volume 1, Part 1. Then we have Volume 1, Part 2. And this will be the contents of Volume 1, Part 2. Again, all by the experts in their field. And these are the remaining volumes as it stands now. But as I said earlier, it's quite possible that all these things will change as things go on, and more volumes added. Certainly more parts will be added. Volume 4 is Science and Engineering, and that is the volume that I will deal with in more detail. Part 1 of Volume 4 is about DJ Vimala Surendra. I'm sure you would have all heard about him. He was the father of hydroelectric engineering in Sri Lanka, and he was the first person really to suggest that we utilize the hydropower for the generation of electricity. He was born in 1874 in Gaul. His father was a jewellery craftsman, and in 1890 he studied at Ananda College, and he passed the London Matric, and he was the first student from Ananda to pass the London Matric. Unfortunately, of course, there were no universities in Ceylon at that time, so he had no chance of a university education. So he joined the PWD, the Public Works Department, as an apprentice, because he was good with his hands and good at making models and so on. And then shortly after he joined the PWD as an apprentice, the Ceylon Technical School started in Maradana, and that has now become the Ceylon Technical College. And they started a diploma in engineering, and he enrolled in the very first batch. And when he completed the course, he was promoted as a head overseer. And a few years later, through self-study, he went to India and studied and sat for the graduate membership examination of the Institution of Civil Engineers and passed it. And he came back, and he was promoted as a district engineer and transferred to Diathalawa. And when he was in Diathalawa, one of the assignments that the government gave him was to go and prospect for gold in the rivers and streams in the upcountry area. And they also arranged for a Dutch engineer, Van Gezel, who was a prisoner of war in Diathalawa, to accompany him. So they went to Muskelia, and they started prospecting for gold, and they started working their way down the river when they came to a big waterfall. And then the Dutch engineer told Vimala Surendra, we may not find gold here, but there's liquid gold in the energy of that waterfall. And that waterfall was at that time called Kirivanelia Falls. And this made Vimala Surendra get very interested in trying to tap the energy available in that waterfalls, and he did some calculations, and he said there's enough energy in that waterfall to light 100,000 electric bulbs. And so he renamed the waterfalls Laksapana Falls or Laksapahana Falls, and that's how it got its new name. Then in 1915, although he was already a chartered civil engineer, he decided to broaden his field and study electrical engineering also. And so he went off to England, although it was during the World War I. He went there and went to Faraday House in London and studied for their examinations, which he passed in very quick time. And then he was elected a graduate member of the Institution of Electrical Engineers, and then later on he got his charter as a chartered electrical engineer. So he was a chartered electrical engineer as well as a chartered civil engineer, a double qualification, which of course nobody had, no Ceylonese had got at that time. And even since then, the number of people who have that double qualification can be counted on the fingers of one hand. So he came back to Sri Lanka, and in 1918, before the Engineering Association, which is now called the Institution of Engineers Sri Lanka, he read a paper on the economics of power utilization in Sri Lanka. And that paper was a historic paper, because in that paper he charted the possibilities of tapping the upper reaches of the Mahavali and the Kailini Ganga for generating hydroelectric power. Of course, the thing was that the British government, they were not interested because this man was talking about generating 50 megawatts and 70 megawatts and this and that, whereas the total load in Colombo at that time was 2 megawatts. And they said, how on earth can we ever utilize that sort of power, and they sort of just shelved these suggestions and reports. Then in 1923, he again recalculated everything and made a fresh submission, which he called Scheme B. That's Vimala Surendra. That's a bronze statue of him, which has been erected at Norton Bridge. That's Laksapana Falls from a 100-year-old postcard. And this is the copy of the original drawing that Vimala Surendra proposed in 1923, and which he called Scheme B. And you can see he has proposed Norton Dam, he has proposed the tunnel which comes into the next valley, and then surge chamber and pipelines going down to the powerhouse here. And that was where he cited the Laksapana powerhouse. And then the transmission lines taking the power down to Colombo. And he also marked on his map the proposed locations for Castlereagh Dam here and Mausakele Dam here. In other words, he had mapped out the entire way in which these two valleys could be utilized for hydropower generation as far back as 1923. And the subsequent developments and the way these two valleys have been developed followed exactly on his suggestions. So the government still not convinced whether this, how could this Ceylonese guy come up with something? Is it really a possibility or worthwhile? So they consulted an engineer by the name of Perry. And Perry was considered to be the sort of leading world authority on hydraulic power at that time. And he came and spent about 2 weeks in Ceylon and went around the scheme and wrote a report saying that it's an excellent scheme and recommended that the government go ahead with it straight away. And so they did. In 1924, they got approval from London to start this hydroelectric scheme. And now still electrical work was under the Public Works Department, the PWD, and the Director of Public Works, the DPW, was the head. Now, Vimala Surendra had suggested this scheme, he had prepared all the drawings, he had prepared all the designs, he had worked out all the estimates, and naturally he expected that he would be asked to carry out the job. But to his surprise, he found that the DPW, the director, appointed a young British engineer by the name of Hughes, who had absolutely no experience in hydropower at all, and asked Hughes to do the job. And he wrote a memo to Vimala Surendra to hand over all the designs, drawings, etc. to Hughes. And as you can well imagine, Vimala Surendra was deeply disappointed. And so he took long leave and went off to England on holiday for about a year. And when he came back from his holiday, he found that the scheme was in a complete mess. The expenditure on the scheme had been far more than the estimate. In some sections like roads and housing, it was 7 times the estimate. There were a lot of mistakes in the construction, and even the surge chamber, they had started building it in the wrong place. So in other words, it was a complete cock-up. And by the time the earlier DPW had retired and gone off, and there was a new DPW, and the new DPW immediately stopped all work on this project. And that was in 1924, although 3 million rupees had already been spent on work so far and had to be written off at the end. So 1927, the government appointed a select committee to investigate into what had gone wrong, and the select committee reported to the Legislative Council and put the entire blame on the Director of Public Works and the British consultants who were involved in this job. And then now it was a serious situation because the building of this hydro scheme had been postponed, and the Peta power station, Peta diesel power station, which was the only power station in Colombo, could not handle the load. So Vimala Surendra was asked to design and build a new power station in Kolanawa, which was called the Stanley Power Station, with steam turbines, and he designed and built that scheme, and that was opened 2 years later. And soon after the scheme was opened, and the governor, who was Stanley, named it after himself, and that's the Stanley Power Station. And soon afterwards, Vimala Surendra reached the age of 55 and decided to retire and not to ask for an extension of service. And then 2 years later, when the Legislative Council had their first elections, he contested the Ratnapura seat and he was elected to the council. When he was in the council, he tried his best to try and get the scheme going again, but that was the time of the Great Depression, and the government simply didn't have the funds to do any work until 1937, when John Kotulawala was the Minister for Transport and Works, and he was able to push through the scheme. And in 1939, contracts were awarded for the construction of Laksapana hydroelectric scheme. Unfortunately, of course, within a few months, the war broke out, and the civil contractor, which was an Indian firm, Hindustan, they stopped work and went off, and equipment contractors, who were all British, they had to stop work because they had to go on into the war effort. And so that was the end of that until the war finished, and then the contracts were re-awarded, and finally in 1950 stage 1 of Laksapana was finally commissioned. Just before the tunnel was completed, Vimala Surendra, who was now in his 70s and not very well, he went in a trolley and rode through the tunnel, and when he came out of the tunnel, this is what he said: "Although it was not my good fortune to execute the scheme I had originated, I am happy that I have lived to see it brought to fruition by my countrymen, and that I should have in the evening of my life been able to see the light, the dawn of which I beheld 50 years ago." So then after that, the remaining stages of Laksapana followed one after the other. There were 25 megawatts more plant erected in Laksapana, that was called Stage 2A in 1958. 1965, the Vimala Surendra Power Station was erected at Norton Bridge and named after him. This is a sketch of the two valleys, and shows how the power was utilized, hydropower. So these are the two rivers. This is Keagamoya, and this is Muskelioya, which starts near Adams Peak is there. It starts from there and comes down. The two join up here and then flow past Kitulgala, and from here onwards it's called Kalinigaga. So the first stage, of course, was the dam here at Norton Bridge, the tunnel, pipeline, and Laksapana powerhouse. The second stage was to construct this dam, Castlereagh Dam, which is much bigger dam than Norton Bridge. Norton Bridge can only hold a few days of water. This can hold water for several months. And then there was this tunnel and pipeline and the Vimala Surendra Power Station here at Norton Bridge, which was completed in 1965. Then the next stage was a dam just below Laksapana Power Station, and tunnel, pipeline, and the Polpitier 75 megawatt power station. This was followed by the Mausakele Dam, which was completed in 1972 for additional storage of water, because these are very small dam. And then following that, Laksapana Falls is here, just above Laksapana Falls, the Canyon Dam, another tunnel, pipeline, and the new Laksapana power station, 100 megawatts. Then another tunnel and pipeline and the Canyon Dam, 60 megawatts, completed in 1989. And finally, a small weir here on the Kergamoya takes the water across to Polpitier, and another dam, small dam there, tunnel, pipeline, and 35 megawatt Broadlands power station, which is now under construction by a Chinese firm and will be completed in the year 2014. And with that, Vimala Surendra's dream is completely fulfilled, and something like 370 odd megawatts of power will be generated in these two valleys. So that's part one of the volume 4 is about Vimala Surendra. I'll go through very briefly about the remaining people about whom there will be articles in volume 4 about the engineers, scientists and engineers. First is Ernest Aberatne, who was recruited by the Department of Agriculture and posted to Maha-Ilupulama, where the department had a small farm, and he worked there for 18 years. And he transformed what was just a farm into a major research center for agriculture. And it was there that the blast resistant and fertilizer receptive rice varieties like H4 and so on were evolved. So major developments in rice cultivation were carried out by Ernest Aberatne. Part 3 is Ray Vijayawardene, who was an outstanding character because he was an agricultural engineer, an inventor, an aviator, and even took part in the Olympics. Now he, in 1955, he was an inventor, and he invented the two-wheel tractor. And then this was developed by a firm called Landmaster in UK, and they started selling these Landmaster tractors all over the world, in Africa, Asia, and all over the place. And they were the market leaders until the Japanese started copying them, and Kubota and others brought out these two-wheel tractors. And Ray Vijayawardene, as usual, rather woolly-headed. He never took out any patents or anything, and he never got any royalties, and he got nothing out of this. And well, one day, actually, Ray was doing a course in Harvard University on business management, and he was asked to make a presentation about his two-wheel tractor. And during question time, somebody got up and asked him, "Did you mechanize small-scale agriculture, or did you mechanize the buffalo?" Now, Ray says he was stuck for an answer, but he managed to mumble something and get away with it. But later on, when he started thinking, he started wondering, what did I really address the correct problem here? After all, the buffalo has many advantages. The buffalo doesn't need imported oil. It thrives on local grass and paddy straw. And the buffalo produces milk with fat content of 6% and ideal for making curd because it's double the fat content of house milk. And the buffalo produces a steady stream of fertilizer. So then he started thinking of what is the problem? The problem is really, why do we use so much of water in our paddy fields? Far more than what is required. Why do we plow so deep? And the reason why this is done is because of weed control. So maybe I was sort of looking at the wrong problem, and well, he was that sort of person. And then later on in life, he started doing a lot of research in his coconut estate, and he increased the yields of coconut, and he also started planting dendro for generating power and so on, and a lot of developments in that field. Apart from his other hobby, of course, which was constructing aeroplanes and flying around. He had a license for autogyros, he had a license for helicopters, and he had a license for fixing aircraft as well. Next is A.N.S. Kulasinghe, who was really the person who popularized the use of pre-stressed concrete in Sri Lanka. And he did this as far back as 1948 when he was working in the Port Commission, and he started building warehouses and jetties and slipways using pre-stressed concrete. He was the founder chairman of the State Engineering Corporation, and he constructed the Puttalam cement works, and then later he was appointed the Port Commissioner and president of the Institution of Engineers and general president of the Sri Lanka Association for the Advancement of Science. He was president of the National Academy of Sciences, and he patented the Kulasinghe CP system of pre-stressed concrete, and he developed the manufacture of Biocon boats using pre-stressed concrete, and he read numerous papers before scientific institutions, and he was also chairman of the National Science Council. Next one is S.Arumugam. He was an irrigation engineer, and he worked for many years in the irrigation department, and while he worked in the Northern Division, he proposed a scheme called the River for Jaffna. And this was a scheme to take the spill water from Iranamadu tank down the river to Elephant Pass, and to convert Elephant Pass into a freshwater lagoon, which it was until then a saltwater lagoon. And inside the Jaffna Peninsula, there are two large lagoons, saltwater lagoons, Vadabanachi Lagoon and Upparu Lagoon. And he proposed that barrages be built where these lagoons join the sea, so that they also become freshwater lagoons, and then to build a canal from Elephant Pass into Vadabanachis to feed all that water. So in one stroke, that would have solved all the water problems in the Jaffna Peninsula, because Jaffna is flat and has no rivers or streams, and depends entirely for water on wells for irrigation, agriculture and domestic use. And it has about 100,000 wells in all. And but because the sea is all around Jaffna, and because of the limestone rock, the seawater percolates into the soil, and as a result 30% of the wells in Jaffna are saline now, and are useless for agriculture or for drinking, and can be used only for washing and that sort of thing. Finally we have engineer Tharavaratnam. He was a civil engineer, and the first job he did was to build the bridge at Peradeniya, the bridge which links the engineering faculty to the main campus. And then shortly after he completed that, he went to UK and he worked with a firm of contractors for some years, and then he went to Nigeria. He worked for the Nigerian government, and then he resigned and he started his own firm called the Nigerian Construction Consortium, which at its peak employed more than 150 Sri Lankan engineers and technicians, and had contracts running into millions of dollars. And while he was there, he agreed in the early 1980s to fund an international conference by Pugwash. But unfortunately that never came to be, because when the Pugwash committee here in Sri Lanka met, they said the money could be better used to fund the work of local scientists than to bring all these top people from Pugwash to have a conference here. And so local symposium on tropical agriculture was held instead. After he retired and came back to Ceylon, he has been propagating a system of what he calls mini wells, and that is to increase the capacity of a well. It's pointless trying to dig deeper or make it, or increase the diameter, because for all that expense, you will only get a small increase in the capacity of the well. So he proposed a way of drilling horizontal tunnels from the bottom of the well, like spokes going out from the well, and by that method he more or less doubled the capacity or the recharge of the well. And there were many sort of industries which use this system, mainly the breweries, soft drink manufacturers, and they increased the capacity of their wells. And he then proposed to the water board that he tendered actually for some small water supply schemes using this system, and his tenders were 30-40% lower than all the others. But of course, the water board were not. They said that it is new technology and this and that. We are not sure whether it will work properly. And it is not new technology because in the Middle East, for instance, this system is called Qanats, and it has been used for 2,000 years. So anyway, he tendered, and then the water board accepted his tenders, but imposed a lot of new. This is the River for Jaffna project, and the Elephant Pass Lagoon and the other two lagoons and the linkage between them. This is the Tondamanar barrage across one of the lagoons. This is another village irrigation work. And so in T.Arumugam case, the water board said, okay, we'll accept your tender, and imposed all these conditions. In other words, they completely moved the goalposts, and of course, since all the tender conditions had changed, T.Arumugam could have refused to accept the tender, and he could walk away. Payment only against production of water, no interim payment. Now all contractors are paid every month according to the work they do, but they said, no, we won't pay you anything until the whole job is finished. Then you have to produce a performance bond. Requirement only for specific quantity and quality of water. You can't just say that without laying down some guidelines or regulations on what you want. Requirement that only tests in the dry season will be acceptable. What does that mean? Which dry season? When? After 1 year, 2 years, 5 years? Requirement that the well be a water retaining structure. The well is a water retaining structure. And the imposition of liquidated damages. First you say you won't pay the man, and then you want to charge him damages. So anyway, he was so keen on propagating his system that he actually agreed to do the job in spite of all these new conditions, and the jobs were successful, although he personally went through a lot of financial difficulties because he had to literally finance the job and was not paid until a few years later. And he was a man who can sort of think outside the box, and his latest proposal is what to do with Kandy. Now the problem with Kandy is in central Kandy there's absolutely no room for any expansion, and you know what the traffic jams are, right, in the heart of Kandy. And apart from shifting Bogambara prison, there's no other way of getting any land. And so T.Arumugam said, simple, what's the worry that 45 acres of land in the heart of Kandy, which is not used, and why don't you use that land? What are you so worried about? And he said, it's quite simple. The area of Kandy Lake is 45 acres. He said, build under the lake. You can have a huge shopping mall, you can have a car park for 2,000 cars, and you can build bypass roads to bypass the center of Kandy, so that through traffic does not have to go through the center of Kandy and goes straight through without any hindrance. So there you are. These are the 6 people about whom volume 4 will write about, and the section about Vimala Surendra was written by me, and the section about T.Arumugam will also be written by me. They have selected me because he was my father. And No doubt there will be others added on. Maybe there will be a part 2 for volume 4 with many other engineers and scientists also coming into it, but all that is in the future. So that's how the project for the Science and Civilization in Sri Lanka series stands at the moment. But no longer it will be, no doubt it is an ongoing project, and there will be many changes before it's finally completed. After all, Needham's China series has now been going on for 60 years. Thank you very much for your attention, and if you have any questions, I will try to answer them. I'm not sure that I can, but I will try. Everybody's happy?
About the candy, the other important point is that it will release the ancient city of Kandy, because the commercial activities that are now there will go into the new city.
Right.
And the old city will be gone, like New Warsaw or Prague, in Europe, they restore that. And you can't even have a motorized vehicle going through that.
Right. Yeah.
So,
But of course, Sri Lanka being Sri Lanka, people say, oh, the water might leak through the roof and come in and all that. Okay. No other questions?
So, excuse me, I have a question, sir.
Sure.
So far we have been using these natural hydraulic power sources. How long we can depend still with the increase of the populations, and do we really need any sort of different power source in future?
There are, of course, Kotmale is under construction, and they'll have the first generator running in a few weeks' time, and in a few months' time, 150 megawatts of power will come from there. But basically, all the major hydroelectric possibilities have now been tapped. So any more hydroelectric development would be mini schemes. So possibly another 200 or 300 megawatts in all may be generated by future hydro schemes. So we must really start thinking, I mean, it's easy to build a coal-fired power station, that's no problem, but then you've got to import the coal. And as far as oil-fired stations or gas-fired stations are concerned, now it's very promising because Cairn, the driller company which is drilling in the Mana Basin, they have found traces of oil and gas which they say may be exploitable in commercial quantities. But so if that is so, then of course that solves the problem. But if not, then the only solution is really renewable sources of energy. One source, the one that Ray Wijewardena was working on, is to cultivate fast-growing crops like Gliricidia, which grows very fast, and then you cut it up and get gas out of that and run engines which generate power. And I think the first power station working on that will be running pretty soon, if it is not already started. And then there's wind power. There's plenty of wind. It's not only Hambantota, Puttalam, Jaffna. There's a lot of wind power going waste. And if you don't want, if the environmentalists say that wind turbines spoil the view, or they have a little bit of noise, or they will kill birds or whatever, you don't need to have the wind generators on land. You can have them offshore within the territorial waters, as they are doing in the English Channel, and countries like Denmark and all that. They have hundreds of wind generators out in the sea. See, so that's not a problem. And then finally there is solar power. See, the cost of solar, up to now the major problem with solar power has been cost. But now the way it is spiraling, the amount of solar installations that are being made all over the world, cost of solar cells, and there's so much research going on all over, that the cost is coming down pretty fast. I mean, and the latest now, a few days ago, the government of India said their target by the year 2020 is to generate 20,000 megawatts from solar cells alone. 20,000 megawatts. Our total consumption is only about 3,000 megawatts. So imagine how much of energy we can generate from solar. So there's a great future for renewable energy for us. Thank you for your question.